Good afternoon and welcome to the annual crop production, January crop production, winter wheat, canola seedings, cotton ginnings, grain stalks, rice stalks, and WASDE briefing. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jewel Burnell, USDA's Deputy Secretary, with us. I also want to welcome Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist, and Sana Bag, USDA's Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics. Madam Secretary, the January reports cover a wide range of commodities and represent a major work product for our agency. We had several folks from our regional field office join us to work on parts of the reports. We are pleased to have the great assistance of Scott Dilworth of our Little Rock office, Tanner Gray of our Harrisburg office, Jody Sprague of our Census Survey Division, Arthur Chapman of our Austin, Texas office, and Mark Hudson of our Florida office. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The crop production and WASDE reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 1 hour of their release. We will not be taking questions for the public. However, NASS and World Board staff are available for email or phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything in this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. I will turn it over to Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch. He will be immediately followed by Dr. Mark Jekanowski, Chair of the World Ag Outlook Board. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe, and welcome. Appreciate you being here this afternoon. As you might guess from looking at the number of report titles on the opening screen here, I've got a lot of information to share with you today. I'll move fairly quickly through things. I want to be respectful of your time, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of information to go through. But rest assured, we'll have as much time as you need at the end for any questions that you might have. So just bear with me as I move through this fairly quickly. As I normally do, I'd like to start things off by talking a little bit about not only the survey work, but some of the other data that we used in compiling these important reports today. Several blocks of information that I'll talk about here. First off, you can see our operator reported surveys. Of course, the big one there is our December Ag survey. You can see we reached out to more than 72,000 producers. Essentially, we were asking them to report their final acreage yield and production for the various crops for 2022. In addition to that, they also reported their quantities of grains and oilseeds stored on their farms as of December the 1st. And of course, for our winter wheat seedings, they also reported to us the number of acres that they have or will plant to winter wheat for the 2023 season, which you'll see those numbers here in a bit as well. In addition to that, we also have our off-farm grain stock survey. Of course, we also need to survey those commercial facilities to find out what they have stored off the farm to give us a complete accounting of the grain stocks. Cotton ginnings, that's pretty critical information this time of year for our cotton estimates. In fact, about 91.9% of our upland cotton was ginned, 79% of the PEMA. So very complete information there. In addition to all of that farmer type survey work, we also have our field surveys, of course, objective yield, corn, cotton, and soybeans. That's basically data that were largely finalized prior to this report. And then for the Florida oranges, of course, the objective measurement there are the size and drop work that we do down there. And you can see both the sample size and the time frame that that work was completed. In addition to all the survey work, of course, some critical data that we get from other folks here at USDA. The FSA certified acres are critical for our planted area estimates this time of year in particular. And then, of course, for both FSA and RMA, the failed acreage information that they're able to provide is very helpful for considering minimal amounts of abandonment when we set our harvested area estimates for the various crops. So tons of information feeding into all of these reports that I'm going to talk about here today. One last piece of information about the background work. Here you can see the sample sizes by state for that December Ag Survey. And as you would expect, you see the larger sample sizes in the areas that are typically more heavily cropped, since that is the focus of the survey work that we're doing here. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the numbers. I always like to start things off looking at the principal crops, kind of that big picture look. For the principal crop total, that is simply the sum of the 22 major crops planted and harvested over the course of the year. You can see final planted area for those crops, 312.1 million acres. A little explaining here on the change from the previous estimate. You can see it's down 1.3%, but that's from going back to June, because that's the last time we actually published this total. But of course, because it is simply the sum of those 22 crops, I can tell you that the change back to June might be 4.15 million acres, but the change leading into this report, just 1.88 million acres. As you know, we've been making some of those planted area adjustments throughout the season. In fact, that 1.88 million acre change is largely due to hay and not necessarily true planted acreage changes there. The other thing that I point out on the slide, you can see year to year planted area down 1.6%, but the harvested area down 4.2%. Obviously a bit more abandonment this year than we saw last year. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we look at the individual crops here in just a moment. This next slide just puts a little bit more perspective around that principal crop total. Here you can see the top number is the planted area, the lower number is the harvested area. Just gives you a few more seasons to kind of reference how those totals compare over recent years. I won't spend too much time on this next chart, but here you can see the lighter colored line puts everything on the kind of the same plane there. Back in 2018, we implemented some program changes that kind of led to a little bit of a level shift there. And so again, if you're going to look back over the time all the way back to 2013, this allows you to do a more true comparison. So we like to make that available for you today. This next map that I have for you just shows you the principal crop planted acreages by state and how they compare with last year's total. The way this map and many others that I'll show you today are laid out, the top number is the principal crop planted acreage total for that state. The lower number is the percent change from last year. Any state that's colored in any shade of red is decreasing from last year. Any shade of blue is increasing, and in both cases, the deeper the shade of the color, the larger the change. And you see mostly lighter shaded colors across the country. A couple that maybe stand out a bit. North Dakota in particular, you can see down 10.3% year over year. Of course, significant prevent plant issues up in North Dakota this year. In fact, that's not terribly uncommon. We kind of see that on a rotational basis up there, but that's having a big impact on the total, even nationally. Another couple of states I'll mention, California and Colorado. You see the ampersand next to the numbers there. That indicates that those are record low levels. So in both of those states, we're looking at record low totals for these 22 major crops planted this season. Next, we're going to move on and start looking at the individual crops. I'll start things off with corn. You can see our final planted area, 88.6 million acres, virtually unchanged from our previous estimate, but down 5% from what was planted last season. Harvested area, we are estimating 79.2 million acres harvested for grain. That's down 2%, or 1.64 million acres from our previous estimate. It's now down 7.2% from the previous season. So again, showing more abandonment, or at least less acres, a smaller portion harvested for grain than what we had previously estimated. Our final yield at 173.3 bushels per acre is up slightly from the previous forecast, but still down 1.9% year over year. That puts our final corn production total at 13.7 billion bushels. That's down 1.4% from the November forecast and 8.9% below what was produced last season. Next, we'll take a quick look at the corn yield and how it compares over the last 30 seasons. You can see the trend line plotted in there. The current season's yield is down 3.4 bushels per acre from last year's record high, and you can see does fall just below trend this year. This next map highlights the corn yields on a state-by-state basis and how they compare with last year. The map is laid out just like the one I showed you just a moment ago for the principal crop planted total. Same rules apply here. One additional item I will point out, though, is anytime you see a pound sign next to a number, that indicates a record high, and we did indeed see record high corn yields this season in Idaho, Illinois, Minnesota, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. You also notice on the map, you can see some fairly sharp declines year over year in the central and southern plains and even eastward through there. Of course, dry conditions really having a big impact on much of that region this year. This next chart just highlights the corn production total and how it compares over the recent seasons. Of course, the 13.7 billion bushel total is down 1.34 billion bushels from what was produced just a season ago. This next chart highlights a couple of things here. First off, you can see a bunch of blue dots on there. Each of them indicates a published industry member's expectation for what the corn production would be. The red blocks indicate the NASS estimate. You can see the red block for the final 13.7 billion bushel total that I talked about is a bit lower than folks were expecting. Again, remember back, we brought down the harvested area. Yield didn't have a significant change. And so it appears as though most folks were not anticipating that increased abandonment. Nonetheless, that could be a little bit of a surprise today. Next, we'll turn our attention to soybeans. Planted area final at 87.5 million acres. That is down just fractionally from the previous estimate, and up just slightly from last year's planted area. On the harvested side, 86.3 million acres. That's down just 0.3% from the previous estimate, up fractionally from last year. Our final yield of 49.5 bushels per acre is off 1.4%, or just 0.7 of a bushel from the last forecast, and 4.3%, or 2.2 bushels below last year's final yield. That puts our final soybean production at 4.288 billion bushels. That is down 1.6% from November and 4.2% below what was produced last season. Taking a quick look at the soybean yields and how they compare over the recent 30 seasons, you can see the current year does fall just below trend, but is still the 5th highest soybean yield on record. Next, we'll take a look at the soybean yields by state and how they compare with last year. Here you can see declines across most of the growing area, a couple of exceptions, North Dakota and Minnesota up from last year. Of course, we had some weather challenges last year in that part of the country, so that's more of a recovery there. A couple of other states I'll point out would be Arkansas and Mississippi. You can see they're unchanged from last year, but at a record high. So again, matching up with last year's record high yields in those states. Looking at the soybean production and how it compares over the recent seasons, not only was, I mentioned, yield was 5th highest, U.S. production also 5th highest total on record this season. Similar to what I showed you for corn, you can see the soybean production estimate today a little bit lower than most of the folks were expecting, so maybe a little bit of a surprise in that number today as well. Next, we'll move on to cotton. Planted area 13.8 million acres. That's down just 0.2%, or only 28,000 acres from our previous estimate. It is up sharply from last year, nearly 23% above what was planted last year. But the real story on the cotton here this season is on the harvested side. You can see the 7.44 million acres harvested this year is 5.5% below what we had previously forecast, 27.6% below what was harvested last year. So big increase on planted, big decrease on harvested, indicating very significant abandonment for cotton this year. That's really a big part of the story. Our final yield at 947 pounds per acre. That's actually up 9.1% from the December forecast, 15.6% above last season, putting our production at 14.7 million bales. That's up 3.1% from December, but again, down 16.2% from last year due to that big decline in harvested area. Looking at the increase on the yield at first thought, we've talked about this earlier this season, Seth, but obviously with the drought conditions, particularly in Texas and areas in around there, obviously a lot of times you don't think about high yields, but when you abandon so many of the worst acres, by default, you end up with a bit higher yield. That oftentimes happens. And in a year like this in particular, where the majority of that abandonment is in Texas, that means other states, for example, Georgia, our second leading producing state, is going to carry a lot more weight in that U.S. yield calculation. And of course, Georgia, higher yielding cotton than Texas. And so you've got a couple of factors that are really pulling that yield up, despite some of the challenging weather conditions that we've had this season. So speaking of the yield, if we take a quick look at that and how it compares, that's actually a record high yield for cotton nationally this season. And you can see the big increase year over year and putting us well above trend for this year. And looking at those cotton yields by state and how they compare with last year, again, you can see Texas actually up fairly sharply on their yield, again, due primarily to the big reduction in the harvested area, taking out those poor performing acres, pushing the yield up. And a couple of pound signs to point out here, record high yields this season for cotton in New Mexico and North Carolina. Just a quick look at the cotton production. Again, the 14.7 million bales, you can see down fairly sharply from last year. And in fact, that is the second lowest all cotton production since 2015. A little bit of a reversal here from what I showed you on corn and soybeans. Here you can see comparing to the published industry expectations, the cotton estimate a little bit higher than what folks were expecting. So maybe a little bit of a surprise there as well. I'll try to move fairly quickly through some of these other crops we're finalizing for 2022. Some interesting things I'll point out along the way. Canola, for example, record high planted and harvested acreage and record high production this season. You can see a fairly sharp increase year over year. Of course, some of that is the result of a bounce back from challenges last year due to some weather issues in the northern part of the country where much of canola is grown. Chickpeas, again, really a bit of a bounce back from last year. You can see the sharp increase in the yield, leading to higher production this year. Similar story with the dry edible beans and even the dry edible peas. You can see those sharp increases in yield, and really flaxseed, for example, as well. So you see increases across all those crops in both yield and production for 2022. We'll talk just a little bit more about hay. Some interesting things happening there this season. In fact, starting with all hay, if you just look at the acreage, you can see it's down 2.3% year over year. Yield also down, putting our production down 6.2%. But as we look at the all hay this year, lowest harvested area since 1906. We had our lowest all hay yield since 2012. So what that means is we actually had the lowest all hay production since 1959. And that really was based on both alfalfa and other hay. Looking at the alfalfa, lowest acres since 1948, lowest production since 1952. The other hay, lowest acres since 1984, and lowest production since 1988. And you're going to see the impact of that on the hay stocks when we get a little bit further into the presentation here today. Next, we'll look at hops. You can see overall the production is down 12.4% year over year. We did see a relatively modest decline in the acres. However, despite that decrease, was still the second highest acres on record, but you can see the yield tumbling quite a bit there. In fact, that's a record low yield for hops, and that's what's driving that reduced production. This season, lentils, similar to what I talked about earlier, with the peas and the dry beans, really a bounce back from some pretty significant problems last year. So big increases on the yield and production there. Kind of the same story on the mustard seed, although a little bit of a difference there, but you see such a sharp increase in the acreage this year. But mustard seed is really a very drought tolerant crop. And so that became very attractive for a lot of folks this year. So we see a very big increase there. in 2022. Looking at the peanut crop this season, you can see both acres and yield below last year's level. So overall peanut production down 12.5% from last season. Still the 7th highest production on record. We did have the 3rd highest yield on record for peanuts this season. Peppermint, you can see down fairly sharply due primarily to the 19% decrease in acres. Yield was also down year over year, but the big driver was really the acreage decline year over year. Potatoes, you can see again, acres, yield, and production all down year over year. That's actually the lowest potato production since 1989. And then you can see proso millet again, kind of continuing that trend of decreased acres and yield. So overall, a fairly sharp decline there. Of course, a lot of that is in Colorado. That's what's driving the decrease. And of course, the drought conditions, very significant in Colorado this season. Again, moving through some of the other crops, you can see rapeseed, fairly sharp decline in the acres there. Yield up just modestly, so overall production off 14.3% from last year, but still the 4th highest production on record. Looking at rice, you can see fairly minor changes compared to our previous forecast, but overall acreage is down fairly sharply this year. Yield came off just a bit as well, so our rice crop for 2022 down 16.3% year over year. We did have the 10th highest yield on record, but that second year, consecutive year of declining production, pulling the level down. California in particular had their lowest planted area since 1958. And of course, the water issues out in California obviously have a big impact on rice acres because of the water requirements there. Next, looking at safflower, 3rd lowest planted acres on record, 4th lowest harvested area. Sorghum, big declines there on both acreage and yield. Of course, we had record low planted and harvested acreage in Texas. The vast majority of our sorghum is produced in Kansas and Texas. And of course, both of those states hit pretty hard by drought this season, having a big impact there. And spearmint down on the acres, slight increase in yield, but overall a little less production this year than last. Moving on to our sugar crops, you can see sugar beets. Again, fairly modest changes from the previous forecast. But overall, year over year, we're looking at 11.4% smaller crop due primarily, due exclusively to the reduced yield, as we did have a slight increase in harvested area this season. Sugar cane actually up from last year, in fact, up from the last forecast and last year. So overall, the sugar cane crop, 5.6% larger than what we produced last season. Sunflowers, you can see again, pretty sharp increase in acres and yield. A lot of that is a rebound from last year with the majority of those acres grown. Up in the northern portion of the plains where we had pretty severe drought conditions last season. So better conditions this year, pushing that back up. And then last but not least, as far as the crops for 2022 production, tobacco, you can see the acres off 5.7%. That puts that at the 2nd lowest harvested acres on record. So despite a slight increase in yield, 2.3% smaller tobacco crop this year. Next, we'll shift gears a little bit. We've kind of wrapped up the 2022 season. Let's talk about 2023. Today, we're releasing our first look at the 2023 winter wheat planted area. You can see we're estimating 37 million acres planted and to be planted. That's up 11.1% year over year, fairly sharp increase there this season. If we take a closer look at that graphically, you can see again, fairly sharp increase, kind of got that increasing trend back after many years of declining acreage. In fact, that does represent the highest planted area since 2016. Of course, prices have been fairly strong, driving more producers back to winter wheat this year. If we look at the winter wheat planted area on a state-by-state basis, again, how it compares with last year, I see a lot of deep blue colors across the country here, showing those sharper increases. A lot of the acreage increase coming in Texas. You can see up 26.4%. But also a tremendous amount of winter wheat grown north of there as we move through Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska. And you can see pretty sharp increases there as well. But even to the east in the soft red area, you can see a lot of sharp increases year over year. In fact, overall, we're looking at increasing or unchanged acreage from last year in 30 of the 35 estimating states for 2023. Looking at the published expectations for winter wheat planted area and how they compare, again, maybe a little bit of a surprise here. You can see that 37 million acre estimate a little bit higher than folks were expecting today. Next, we'll shift gears once again. This time we're going to move over and talk about grain stocks. I'll start with all wheat stocks, since this is second quarter stocks for all wheat. You can see as of December the 1st, 1.28 billion bushels were stored. That is down 7% or 97 million bushels from what was stored at the same time last year. Taking a look at this next graphic, the way it's laid out, each of those vertical bars represents the beginning supply for those crop seasons. The four horizontal lines represent the 4 quarterly stocks estimates, as I mentioned, for wheat second quarter. So the December 1 stocks, the orange line on the graphic there, as of December 1st, that we're looking at the lowest December stock since 2007. Beginning supply was down 5.7% from the previous year, and our September to November disappearance at 498 million bushels was up 25.6% from the previous season. Even with that in mind, we are looking at a stocks total that's a little bit lower than most folks were expecting. So maybe a little bit of a surprise with that number today as well. Next, we'll move on to the corn stocks. This is first quarter or beginning stocks for corn and for soybeans when we get there next. But as of December the 1st, 10.8 billion bushels of corn were stored both on and off the farm. That is down 7.1% or 832 million bushels from what was stored at the same time a year earlier. You can see fairly comparable declines across the on-farm and the off-farm if we look at it on a year-by-year basis. And now looking at the same graphic I showed you for the wheat stocks, here you can see all corn. The beginning supply at 15.1 billion bushels was down 7.4% from the previous season, and our September to November disappearance for corn, 4.3 billion bushels, down 7.9% from the same time period a year earlier. Taking a quick look at the stocks and how they compare with expectations, you can see down toward the lower end. But think back to what I showed you with the corn production. Again, the reduction in the production that we made was a bit of a surprise to folks. And so I guess it's not really surprising that if they didn't realize production was going to be down, that they didn't necessarily expect the stocks to be on the lower side of things as well. So I think that kind of ties together actually fairly well there. Next, we'll move into soybeans. As of December the 1st, 3.02 billion bushels stored for that crop. That's down 3.6% from the previous year. Again, like corn, the change from last year for both on and off farm, pretty comparable overall. And as we look at the crop, again, over time here, the 4.55 billion bushel beginning supply for soybeans was down 3.6% from the previous year. And our September to November disappearance for soybeans was off 3.6% from the same time a year earlier. Continuing that trend of being a little bit outside where most folks were expecting. You see, somebody was helping us out there with a lower expectation, but generally speaking, the soybean stocks, again, a little bit lower than most folks were expecting, probably because, again, of that lower production number that we came out with today. Got a little ahead of myself there. There we go. Next, we'll take a look at the December rough rice stock. So as of December the 1st, you can see 106 million hundredweight were stored. That was down 16.7% year over year, a little bit sharper decline on the on-farm side, but nonetheless declines in both on and off-farm compared to a year ago. Looking at this graphically, you can see the 193 million hundredweight beginning supply off pretty sharply from the previous season. And then overall, our disappearance was a little bit below what we had seen at the same time last year. Also included in our monthly crop production report today is the December 1 hay stocks totals. And you can see as of December the 1st, 71.9 million tons were stored. That's down 9% from what was stored at the same time a year earlier. In fact, that's the lowest December 1 stock since 1954. Of course, I talked a lot about the hay production for this year being at relatively historic low levels. And so as a result, as you might expect, lower quantities of hay on hand as of December the 1st. And so our beginning supply there, just 130 million tons. Our disappearance from May to November was 57.6 million tons, down 3% from the same time a year earlier. If we take a look at the hay stocks by state and how they compare with last year, you can see a lot of dark red colors, particularly in the center of the country to the south, that heavy drought area that we've talked about a lot this season, really having a big impact on hay stocks levels there. Some increases to the north, but again, as I've talked about with some of the other crops, that's a portion of the country that really had a lot of weather issues last year. So we're talking about some rebounding happening there compared to where they were last year. Some ampersands to point out here again, record low hay stocks in California, Colorado, and Nebraska as of December the 1st. Just a few other commodities to cover regarding stocks. I'll move quickly here. You can see barley stocks up 17% year over year. Chickpea stocks up. Dry edible pea stocks up fairly sharply. Durum wheat, you can see up 14.6% from what was stored a year earlier. Lentils up 12.2%. Oats down just slightly year over year, and of course a big decline year over year in the sorghum stocks. As I mentioned earlier, big cuts in production this year due to the dry conditions in Texas and Kansas this year. Nearing the home stretch here, just to shift gears one more time, we do also have an updated forecast for our citrus crops, and since it's January, we do have all states reporting this month. So we're now forecasting 2.7 million tons of all oranges produced. That is down 4.6% from last month's forecast, 22.1% below what was produced last season. Of course, when we talk about oranges, we often talk about Florida. Florida this month, down another 2 million boxes from what we had forecast just last month. No change to the non-Valencias, but the Valencias, of course, is where that 2 million box decline month over month is. But what's really interesting with Florida is we're looking at some pretty low levels there as well. If we look at the non-Valencias, we're essentially looking at record low production in Florida this year for the Valencia crop, lowest total since the 1937-38 season. That means all oranges in Florida are expected to be at the lowest level since the 1930-31 season. California orange production also expected to be down a bit from the previous forecast, down 1 million boxes there. That's due to a change in the Valencia portion of the crop there. Texas orange production unchanged from our last forecast there. Looking at the grapefruit production, 324,000 tons expected to be produced. That's up just slightly from last month, but down 13.4% year over year. Lemon production expected to be down 9.1% year over year. And last but not least, the tangerines, you can see actually up 23.5% year over year. That crop grown primarily in California, and they are actually expecting a 2 million box increase from the October forecast and 4.6 million boxes more than was produced last season. Just a few slides I'll run through fairly quickly. Here you can see a list of some of the upcoming reports over the next month or so, leading us out to February 8th, where we'll have our next crop production report and be back here to talk about that. We certainly want to remind folks of the upcoming USDA Ag Outlook Forum. Registration is open. That will be both in person or virtually, depending on how you choose to participate, but registration is open for both. And then also we are going to be involved in co-hosting the 9th ICAST conference here in Washington, D.C., May 17th through May 19th. Early bird registration is ending soon. There's a significant discount there. So if you're interested in that, you want to make sure you get out there and get registered soon. And then last but not least, as usual, here in just a few moments this afternoon, I will be out on Twitter answering any questions that folks might have about today's reports. And so look for me out there if you've got any questions. I'd love to answer them. And that is the last slide that I have for you. As I mentioned, once Mark finishes his portion of the briefing, we'll have lots of time. We can answer any questions that you might have about all the numbers that I've shared here. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.